Elena had never been the kind of woman who drew attention when she walked into a room. She dressed in simple clothes, kept her hair neatly tied, and carried herself with quiet dignity. On that bright morning, when she entered the army training ground, nobody noticed her at first. The place was full of noise, young recruits shouting, running drills, and a loud, commanding sergeant barking orders. Dust rose with every heavy boot that struck the ground. Elena paused at the edge of the ground, watching them. She had no uniform, no badges, no sign that she belonged in that place. To the men, she looked like someone's aunt or a visitor who had lost her way. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were calm but sharp, like someone who had seen much more than she cared to show. One of the recruits noticed her standing there and nudged his friend. Soon a ripple of whispers passed through the group. Some of the men laughed quietly, some openly stared. A few muttered rude remarks, certain she had no business in a place meant for rough, disciplined soldiers. "Ma'am," the sergeant finally called out, his deep voice carrying across the field. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his uniform fitted neatly, his tone filled with authority. "This isn't a place for sightseeing. We're in the middle of training." Elena walked closer, her steps steady. Dust clung to her shoes, but she didn't mind. "I want to join the demonstration," she said simply, her voice calm, almost soft, yet strong enough for everyone to hear. For a moment, silence fell. Then laughter broke out from the recruits. They couldn't believe their ears. A plain-looking woman, standing in the dirt, asking to join their self-defense training? To them, it was absurd. "Did you hear that?" one recruit said, chuckling. "She wants to join the demo." Another laughed louder. "She won't last a second. She might break a bone." Even the sergeant smirked. He wasn't cruel, but he had the kind of pride that came from years of being in charge. To him, Elena seemed harmless, just a woman who had no idea what she was asking for. Still, he decided to humor her. Maybe it would entertain his men and remind them of their strength. "All right then," the sergeant said, folding his arms. "If you insist. Let's see what you've got. Boys, give her a little test." The recruits grinned. They formed a circle, the way they did during sparring sessions. Elena stepped inside, standing straight, her face expressionless. The men circled her like wolves around a sheep, convinced this would be over in seconds. The first recruit, a tall young man with strong arms, moved forward. He reached out, grabbed her lightly, and with a quick push, sent her stumbling backward. Elena caught herself before she fell, but dust covered her hands. Laughter erupted again. "Come on, ma'am," another shouted. "You should go home before you get hurt." But Elena stayed. She brushed the dirt from her palms and returned to the center of the circle. Her silence only seemed to irritate the recruits more. The second recruit stepped forward. This one didn't hold back. He gave her a harder shove, and this time Elena lost balance. She hit the ground with a thud, the dust rising around her like smoke. The crowd roared with laughter. "There! Told you she couldn't last," someone shouted. "She doesn't belong here," another added. "This is for real soldiers, not for women who should be home cooking." Elena slowly pushed herself up, her face still calm, though her clothes were now dirty. She didn't argue, didn't shout back. She simply stood again. That silence unnerved a few of them, but the louder voices drowned out the uneasy ones. "Try again," the sergeant ordered, his voice full of amusement. A third recruit rushed in, grabbing Elena by the arm. He twisted her wrist lightly, expecting her to cry out. Instead, she let herself fall forward into the dirt, as if she didn't resist at all. The group burst out laughing again, thinking she had surrendered without even trying. "Pathetic," someone muttered. By now, Elena's knees and hands were coated in dust. She looked like she had truly been thrown in the dirt like trash. But inside, something was building. She wasn't angry. No anger clouded the mind. What she felt was a quiet resolve, the same kind of calm strength she had learned years ago from her father. Her father's voice seemed to echo in her mind, strength isn't about showing off. It's about knowing when to use it. Let them laugh. When the time comes, they'll see. The sergeant finally stepped forward. Enough games, he said, waving the recruits back. His eyes twinkled with pride and challenge. I'll show you myself. The men cheered, eager to see their sergeant put the stranger in her place once and for all. They had seen him break down recruits twice her size. No one ever escaped his grip. Elena turned her head slightly, watching him approach. For a moment, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. It wasn't arrogance, it was the calmness of someone who already knew what was about to happen. The sergeant stood before her, towering over her, his boots planted firmly in the dirt. He offered his hand mockingly, as if inviting her into a dance. Ready? He asked. Elena didn't reply. She simply straightened her back, wiped the dust from her face, and raised her hands in a quiet stance. The recruits laughed again. They couldn't imagine she had any skill at all. All right then, the sergeant said. Let's begin. He reached for her, his movements swift and confident, wrapping her in a military hold designed to immobilize. The crowd cheered, certain it was over. To them, Elena was nothing more than a simple woman who had made the mistake of stepping into their world. But Elena's silence, her calm eyes, and the faint smile she carried told a different story, one that none of them were ready to see yet. And as the sergeant tightened his grip, convinced victory was his, Elena was already preparing to show them who she truly was. The sergeant's grip was strong, and his posture showed years of training. His hands closed tightly around Elena's arm, locking her in place, as if he were handling a recruit who had no chance of breaking free. The recruits standing in the circle cheered and clapped, certain that this little show was already over. They had seen their sergeant use the same hold dozens of times before. It was his favorite move because it never failed. Young men, bigger and stronger than Elena, had tried to resist, but none could escape. To the recruits, it was almost a joke that this plain woman had even dared to challenge him. See that, one of the men shouted. She can't move an inch. Another recruit laughed. She's finished. The sergeant's hold is unbreakable. But while the crowd laughed, Elena's face remained calm. There was no fear, no panic in her eyes. She stood still, her body giving no sign of struggle, and that quietness began to unsettle a few who were watching more closely. The sergeant leaned down slightly, his voice low but full of pride. You asked for this, he said, his tone carrying a warning. Now you know your mistake. My men don't go easy, and neither do I. Elena did not answer. Instead, her mind drifted back to memories she carried deep inside, memories of her father. He had been a strict man, not a soldier but a master of an old martial art passed down through generations. As a child, Elena had spent hours in their backyard, practicing movements again and again until her muscles memorized every step. Her father used to say, strength is not in the arms. It is in the heart, in the mind, and in the timing of the body. Those words lived inside her even now, like a quiet fire that never went out. While the sergeant tightened his hold, Elena's breathing slowed. She wasn't afraid of his strength. She knew something the recruits did not: no matter how strong a grip, there was always a way to turn it into weakness. She had been taught that the bigger the opponent, the harder they fell when balance was broken. The recruits shouted louder, enjoying the show. Some clapped their hands and called for the sergeant to end it quickly. Others laughed at Elena's silence, mistaking it for helplessness. Look at her, one man said. She's frozen. She doesn't even know what to do. But deep inside, Elena knew exactly what to do. She was waiting. Timing mattered more than anything. The sergeant, growing impatient with her calmness, decided to push further. He gave a strong jerk, trying to pull her off her feet. Elena bent slightly with the movement, letting him think she was losing balance. Gasps of laughter rang out from the recruits, but in that very moment, Elena's eyes sharpened. Her father's lessons whispered in her mind again: never resist head-on. Flow with the attack. When your opponent thinks you are weak, that is when your strength is most dangerous. The sergeant adjusted his stance, unaware that Elena had already studied his posture, his weight, and the exact angle of his grip. Every detail mattered. She could feel his strength pressing against her, but she also felt where it was weakest. Give up, the sergeant said firmly, as if giving her a chance to surrender before he embarrassed her further. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. Are you sure? The words surprised him. He expected fear, maybe a cry for help, but not confidence. His brows furrowed for a brief second, and the recruits stopped laughing, sensing a shift they couldn't explain. One of the younger recruits whispered to his friend, "Did you see her eyes? She doesn't look scared," but before his words could spread, the sergeant tightened his hold again, determined to prove his dominance. The circle of recruits cheered, trying to drown out the unease. In that silence within herself, Elena remembered a night long ago. She had been just 12 years old, training with her father in the rain. He had locked her in a hold far tighter than the sergeant's, his voice harsh but encouraging. She had cried in frustration, but her father had whispered through the storm, "Breathe. Listen to their body. Every hold has a breaking point. Find it." Now, years later, that lesson returned. Elena could feel the sergeant's muscles flexing. She could sense the pressure in his grip. And she knew he was about to discover that his unbreakable hold was not as invincible as he believed. The recruits around them had no idea what was coming. To them, it was only a matter of time before the sergeant threw Elena back into the dirt. Some even shouted, "Finish it! Toss her down!" But Elena's patience had reached its end. She had allowed them to laugh, to mock, and to think she was powerless. Now it was her turn to move. Her breathing grew steady, her body loose, and her eyes focused. The crowd would see soon enough. She wasn't just a woman in plain clothes. She was someone who had carried the weight of training, discipline, and hidden strength for years. The sergeant smirked again, pulling her arm tighter, believing the crowd's laughter was his victory. Yet in that very moment, Elena shifted her stance slightly, so small a movement no one noticed. Her foot pressed into the dirt, grounding her balance. The recruits thought the show was ending. They believed they had seen the whole story. But what they didn't know was that the real demonstration hadn't even begun. Elena's calm expression hid the storm that was about to break loose. The sergeant, certain of his control, was seconds away from realizing that everything he believed about power and weakness was about to be turned upside down. And when it happened, the crowd would no longer be laughing. They would be frozen in shock, their eyes wide, their pride shattered, as they watched the plain woman in the dirt reveal who she really was. The recruits around the circle leaned forward, their faces full of confidence that the sergeant had already won. To them, this was nothing more than a short spectacle. They waited for the moment when Elena would fall again, covered in dust, her spirit broken under the weight of a man who had mastered countless recruits. But then, it happened. In a single movement, Elena shifted her weight, using the ground beneath her feet as her anchor. She bent her arm slightly, not fighting against the sergeant's force but flowing with it. The sergeant didn't realize what she was doing until it was too late. With a sharp, precise twist, Elena rotated her wrist and elbow, slipping out of the grip that had never failed him before. The sergeant's eyes widened as he felt the lock break apart in seconds. The crowd gasped loudly, the laughter silenced in an instant. They had never seen anyone escape his hold, not even the strongest men among them. And yet, This woman, this stranger they had mocked, had snapped free with almost effortless grace. The sergeant tried to recover quickly, lunging again, but Elena was faster. With a controlled motion, she redirected his momentum, guiding his arm downward while stepping aside. It wasn't brute strength that moved him, it was precision. His balance slipped, and he stumbled forward, kicking up dust as the recruits shouted in shock. One of the younger men whispered, how did she do that?" Another muttered, "No one's ever broken the sergeant's hold." The circle that had once laughed at her now stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths half open in disbelief. The sergeant regained his footing, embarrassed but unwilling to show weakness in front of his men. His pride burned hotter than the sting in his arm. He rushed at Elena again, this time with more force, intending to pin her to the ground. But Elena was ready. Her movements were fluid, almost like water. She stepped aside at the perfect moment, using his strength against him. Her hand pressed lightly against his back, guiding him forward, and before the recruits could blink, the sergeant was thrown off balance once again, forced to stumble a few steps to keep himself from falling flat. Gasps echoed through the training ground. She flipped him without even trying," someone shouted. "No way. That can't be real," another said, rubbing his eyes as if he had imagined it. The recruits couldn't believe what they were seeing. To them, their sergeant was unbeatable. Yet Elena wasn't just resisting him, she was controlling the fight. Her calm face and steady movements made it look like she wasn't even exerting full effort. The sergeant's pride flared. He clenched his fists, his face red with frustration. Again, he barked, charging toward her with all the strength in his body. This time, a few recruits stepped forward, unable to hold themselves back. They wanted to help their leader, to put an end to the humiliation. 3 of them rushed into the circle, surrounding Elena from different sides. "Careful," one recruit shouted. "She's fast." But Elena didn't look alarmed. She stood perfectly still, her eyes sharp and steady, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. The first recruit lunged, reaching for her arm. In a blur, Elena sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and twisted gently but firmly. He cried out in surprise as his knees buckled, and she guided him to the ground without even striking him. The second came from behind, trying to grab her shoulders. Elena dropped low, sweeping her leg in a smooth arc. The recruit lost his balance and crashed into the dirt with a grunt. The third recruit froze, unsure whether to move. His eyes darted between his fallen companions and Elena's calm stance. He raised his fists but hesitated, sweat trickling down his forehead. Elena tilted her head slightly, as if giving him permission to try. He lunged forward with a shout, but she caught his arm mid-swing. With a sharp turn, she redirected his momentum and sent him stumbling forward, nearly colliding with the sergeant himself. The circle exploded with shouts of disbelief. She just took them all down. In seconds. "Did you see that?" "It's impossible," the recruits who had laughed earlier now stared in silence, their faces pale. Some looked at Elena with awe, others with fear, but none dared to laugh anymore. The sergeant stood frozen for a brief moment, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He had thought of her as a weak outsider, someone unworthy of his attention. Now he realized he was facing someone who had trained far beyond what he imagined. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. Elena's eyes softened, but her tone remained calm. "Someone you underestimated." Her words echoed in the circle, sinking into every recruit who had mocked her just minutes ago. They realized she wasn't just strong, she was disciplined, skilled, and far beyond their level of training. The sergeant clenched his fists tighter, but deep inside, even he knew that something had shifted. He had seen many fighters, many recruits who tried to prove themselves. But none had moved like her. None had turned his strength against him so easily. The recruits whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but filled with awe. "She's not just some woman," one said. She's trained. Really trained." Another nodded. "I think she might be better than all of us." Elena stood silently in the center, her breathing calm, her stance relaxed. She hadn't shouted, hadn't gloated, hadn't even raised her voice. Every move she made was precise, efficient, and powerful. The dust that covered her clothes earlier no longer looked like a sign of weakness. Instead, it was proof that she had endured their humiliation and risen stronger. For the first time, the training ground was silent. The recruits who had treated her like trash now looked at her with something new, respect mixed with fear. And as the sergeant stared at her, realizing he had lost control of the moment, the truth became clear to everyone: the simple woman they had thrown into the dirt was not weak. She was someone far greater than they had imagined. And this was only the beginning. The training ground was silent. The dust from the scuffle still hung in the air, and the recruits stood frozen, staring at Elena as if they had seen a ghost. A few men still rubbed their wrists or brushed dirt from their uniforms where they had been thrown down, but none of them dared to step forward again. The sergeant's chest rose and fell as he struggled to keep his pride intact. He had never been challenged like this, not in front of his men. His authority had been built over years of discipline and victories, yet here he was, shaken by a stranger who had defeated him with calm, controlled movements. He tried to regain his composure. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice louder this time, more demanding. Elena stood in the center of the circle, her posture straight but relaxed. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice or mock the men who had mocked her. Instead, she let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing them to feel the weight of what had just happened. Finally, she spoke. "You see a woman who looks ordinary. You see simple clothes, a quiet face, and you think you know her worth. But you are wrong." Her words were not shouted, but they carried across the ground like the strike of a drum. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, the memory of their laughter now a heavy shame in their hearts. Elena's eyes turned toward the sergeant. "You think strength comes from loud orders, from holding others down. But strength is not pride. Strength is not arrogance. True strength is discipline, respect, and the control of power." The recruits glanced at each other, some lowering their heads, unable to meet her gaze. She took a slow step forward, her voice steady. "I was trained by a man you could not hope to defeat. My father was a martial arts master, respected across countries. From the time I could walk, he taught me discipline. While other children played, I trained. While others slept, I practiced under the moonlight. And while others laughed at me, I learned to let their laughter sharpen me instead of break me." The recruits listened, their earlier arrogance vanishing as her words unfolded a story they had never expected. Elena continued, her eyes never leaving the sergeant. "Years ago, I competed at the highest level. World tournaments, championships, you name them, I was there. And I did not lose. But one day, I chose to walk away. I grew tired of crowds cheering only for the fight and forgetting the lessons behind it. I wanted to live quietly, to use what I knew only when needed." The recruits' jaws dropped. The idea that the woman they had mocked had once stood on the world stage as a champion shook them to their core. One of the younger recruits whispered, "That's impossible, she can't be the same person." But another, older recruit's eyes widened as recognition struck him. "Wait. I've heard of her. Years ago, there was a champion, Elena Vargas. She disappeared after winning her last title. Nobody knew where she went. That's her. It has to be." The name spread through the circle like fire. Elena Vargas. Some of the men had read about her, seen old clips of her fights. They remembered the speed, the precision, the grace with which she defeated opponents twice her size. And now she was standing in front of them, covered in dirt but radiating quiet power. The sergeant clenched his fists, his pride warring with the truth he could no longer deny. If you were that skilled, why hide? Why come here and make a spectacle? Elena shook her head softly. I did not come here to make a spectacle. I came to observe. I wanted to see how soldiers train, how they are taught to respect power. But what I saw today was arrogance. You mocked a stranger, threw her in the dirt as if she were nothing, and left. That is not strength, it is weakness disguised as pride. Her words pierced deeper than any strike could. The recruits shifted uneasily, their earlier laughter now a memory they wished they could erase. The sergeant opened his mouth to argue, but the truth of her demonstration held him silent. He had been defeated not by brute force, but by skill and wisdom he couldn't match. Elena looked around the circle, her voice softer now but still firm. Each of you has the chance to be strong. Not just strong in the body, but strong in respect, in humility, in understanding that power is not for mocking others but for protecting them. If you cannot learn this, then all your drills and shouts mean nothing. The silence deepened. The recruits, who had once looked at her as a joke, now looked at her as a teacher, someone who had shown them the truth in a way no lecture could. Elena turned back to the sergeant. She saw the struggle in his eyes, pride against humility, authority against respect. She did not hate him, she pitied the way his pride blinded him. Finally, she offered her hand. The simple gesture shocked the men even more than her earlier skill. After all the humiliation, after being thrown down and mocked, she extended respect to the very man who had disrespected her. The sergeant hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he did not move. But then, slowly, as the weight of the moment pressed on him, he took her hand. Her grip was firm, steady, and far stronger than he expected. She pulled him up, not as a victor dragging a loser, but as an equal offering dignity. A murmur rippled through the recruits. They had never seen their sergeant look humbled, never seen him accept another's strength so openly. Elena looked at the men once more. Do not remember me as the woman who embarrassed your sergeant. Remember me as the woman who reminded you what strength really is. The recruits bowed their heads, some out of respect, others out of shame. They would not forget this day, not because of the shock of her skill, but because of the lesson she carried with it. The sergeant, still breathing heavily, finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier pride. You've taught us something today. Something none of us will forget. Elena gave a small nod, then stepped back, leaving the circle. She did not demand applause, did not wait for praise. Her steps were slow, steady, as if she had merely completed what she came to do. But in the eyes of every man standing there, she was no longer the stranger they had mocked. She was someone greater, a teacher, a warrior, and above all, a reminder of the respect they had lost. The ground where they had once thrown her like trash had now become the stage where she rose above them all. And as she walked away, dust clinging to her clothes, the recruits knew the story of Elena Vargas would live in their minds forever. The training ground was quiet, but the air was heavy with tension and awe. The recruits, who had once laughed and mocked, now stood frozen in thought. Elena's presence had changed everything. She had demonstrated strength they could not imagine, humility they could not expect, and wisdom they had never learned in their drills. She moved slowly through the crowd, letting each person feel the weight of her calm authority. Her steps were deliberate, almost like she was measuring the ground beneath her, the dust settling with every motion. The recruits watched her, unable to look away, each one trying to understand how one woman could carry such power with such composure. The sergeant followed behind her, still rubbing his sore wrist but now with a growing sense of respect. He had spent years instructing men, believing that toughness and aggression were the markers of true strength. Today, Elena had shattered that illusion. "Gather around," she said, her voice soft but commanding. There was no anger in her tone, only the quiet authority of someone who had seen life beyond simple contests of force. The men moved closer, forming a circle around her. The dust swirled in the sunlight, creating a thin haze that made the moment feel almost sacred. Elena looked at each recruit in turn, her eyes sharp, intelligent, and filled with understanding. "You have seen what happens when pride leads a person to underestimate someone else," she began. "You laughed at me because of my appearance. You thought because I am a woman and wear simple clothes, I was weak. You threw me to the ground, assuming it would make you stronger. But strength is not found in mocking others. Strength is found in knowing yourself, in knowing your limits, and in using your abilities wisely." She paused and let her words sink in. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind stirring the dust around them. Elena continued, "I did not come here to embarrass you, though you may have felt it. I came here to show you the difference between force and control. To show you that a true warrior does not rely on fear or intimidation. A true warrior earns respect through skill, discipline, and humility." Some of the younger recruits shifted nervously. They remembered their earlier laughter and teasing. Their faces burned with shame as they realized how wrong they had been. One of them, barely 20, finally spoke. I didn't realize. I thought strength was being loud and powerful." Elena turned to him, her expression softening. "It is easy to think that way when you are young. But the world teaches you through mistakes. Today, you have learned the truth firsthand. Remember it. Let it guide you as you continue your training." Another recruit, older and more seasoned, raised his head, his voice trembling slightly. "And what about the sergeant? How can we respect authority after it faltered?" Elena smiled faintly. "Authority is not about fear. It is about responsibility. The sergeant made a mistake, yes. But he also showed humility in accepting the lesson. That is what earns respect, not blind power." The sergeant cleared his throat, his face still red from earlier embarrassment. "Elena is right. I was wrong to assume strength comes from shouting and dominating. Today, I've learned something I will not forget. Not just as a sergeant, but as a man." The recruits listened, some nodding, others silent. Their perception of the world, of power, and of strength had shifted in ways they had never imagined. They were beginning to see that the lessons of a true warrior were deeper than any drill or fight they had known. Elena took a step back, surveying the entire group. "Your training is not just about combat. It is about understanding yourself, understanding others, and using your abilities to protect and guide, not to humiliate. Never forget that." A young recruit whispered to his friend, I think she's the greatest fighter alive. But it's not just fighting. It's the way she carries herself, the way she teaches without shouting. She's like a force of nature." Her words had touched something deeper than physical skill. She had shown them courage, intelligence, and grace. They had seen someone rise above insult, above fear, and above expectation, and they had felt the weight of that example pressing upon them. Elena crouched slightly and picked up a small stone from the ground, tossing it lightly in her hand. "Every action has consequences," she said quietly. "Every decision you make, every choice to act with respect or cruelty, will shape the world around you. Remember that power is not measured by what you can destroy, but by what you can protect." The recruits nodded solemnly. They were learning lessons they had never been taught in the classroom or on the training field. Lessons about humility, courage, and responsibility that would stay with them for a lifetime. Elena stood tall again, her eyes scanning the group one last time. "You may go back to your training now. But remember today. Remember what you learned about strength, respect, and honor. Do not let arrogance cloud your judgment again. Do not let fear or pride decide your actions. Let wisdom guide you." The sergeant stepped forward, his tone respectful. "Thank you, Elena. You've changed how we see our work, our training, and ourselves. We owe you more than words can express. Elena shook her head gently. I do not need thanks. I need only that you learn. That is enough. She turned and began to walk away, her movements calm and confident. The dust swirled around her like a silent applause. The recruits watched in silence, feeling a mix of awe and inspiration. They had witnessed something extraordinary, an ordinary-looking woman demonstrating extraordinary skill and wisdom, teaching a lesson they would carry forever. As she reached the edge of the training ground, she paused. She glanced back one last time, her eyes meeting the sergeant's. In that look, there was understanding, respect, and a quiet challenge. She was leaving, but the lesson would remain. The sergeant, humbled and thoughtful, nodded. We will not forget this day. None of us will. One of the recruits, younger than most, whispered, I want to be like her, not just strong, but wise. Strong and fair. Another nodded, his voice firm. Me too. I'll never mock someone again. I'll remember what it really means to be strong. The men began to disperse slowly, each carrying a different feeling. Some were embarrassed, some inspired, and some quietly proud to have witnessed a true master at work. But all of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Elena walked down the path, leaving footprints in the dust, each one a reminder of the path she had carved not through violence or pride, but through skill, courage, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be underestimated. As she disappeared from view, the sun dipped low, casting a golden light across the training ground. The recruits remained behind, staring after her, thinking about what they had learned and what they still needed to become. It was more than a lesson in combat. It was a lesson in life, in respect, in understanding that appearances could be deceiving and that true strength came from within. From that day forward, Elena Vargas became a legend among the recruits. Not just for her skill, not just for the way she had humbled the sergeant, but for the way she had taught them what it really meant to be strong. Years later, they would tell the story of the woman who had walked into their lives like any stranger, fought without malice, and left without boasting, but whose presence had forever changed the way they saw the world and themselves. And for Elena, she continued her quiet journey, helping only when needed, teaching only those willing to learn, and living a life that few would ever fully understand but many would remember. Because strength, she knew, was not in being feared. Strength was in being respected, and in showing the world that true power came with wisdom, humility, and heart.